Member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to start, I'd like to say that I'm splitting my time with the honourable member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, my perspective on this motion is a Newfoundland and Labrador perspective. And in that light, I begin. First, the fishery, now the fishermen. That will be a theme throughout my speech. First, the fishery was destroyed. Under consecutive federal, Liberal and Conservative governments, ground fish stocks such as cod and flounder were practically wiped off the face of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. There's been an embarrassing lack of recovery. In fact, there are no plans for a recovery. The Conservatives voted against that bill, my bill, the Newfoundland and Labrador Rebuilding Act, last fall. So 20 years after the biggest layoff in Canadian history, comparable to the Prairie Dust Bowl of the 1930s, and of course I'm speaking about the shutdown of the northern cod fishery, the anniversary, Mr. Speaker, is coming up on July the 2nd. You should mark that on your calendar. And there's been no recovery. There is no recovery plan. Mr. Speaker, first our fishery was abandoned. Now our fishermen and our mariners are being abandoned. Systematically abandoned. The latest blow are the proposed changes to employment insurance. Changes that, as I said Wednesday during question period, Mr. Speaker, will empty what's left of rural Newfoundland and Labrador, what we call the outports. It will empty what's left. First the fishery, now the fishermen. Mr. Speaker, today's motion calls on the Conservative government to abandon plans to restrict access to employment insurance for Canadian workers who have followed the rules and who will now be forced to choose between taking a pay cut of up to 30% or losing their employment insurance benefits. These changes amount to an attack on seasonal workers. The Conservative government is telling frequent EI claimants that they will be required after 6 weeks of collecting benefits to take any work available within a 1-hour commute, providing it pay at least 70% of what they were making before they were laid off. Tell me that won't hurt, Mr. Speaker. 2 hours of commuting for a job that pays 30% less, and probably daycare expenses and fuel expenses. There are no subways in Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. That may be news to the out-of-touch Conservative government. There are no subways in rural Newfoundland and Labrador. So 30% less pay with increased expenses. In so many rural areas, there is little other work besides seasonal industries like the fishery, like forestry, like tourism. There is little other work. That is a reality. Most seasonal workers would be classified as frequent claimants. There was a point in time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to point this out, there was a point in time a few decades ago when the fishery employed fishermen and plant workers full-time, year-round, 52 weeks a year. But that gets back to my point about the fishery being destroyed under consecutive Conservative and Liberal governments.
And the need for an inquiry.
And the need for an inquiry. Instead of changing EI rules, the Conservative government should come up with a rebuilding plan for fish stocks off Newfoundland and Labrador. That would get my people back to full-time work. How's that for a novel idea? How's that for a novel idea to get Canadians back to work?
Great idea.
The Conservative changes to EI punish frequent EI claimants. It punishes seasonal workers. According to the St. John's Telegram, the daily newspaper in my riding, Newfoundland and Labrador is the province with the single highest number of frequent EI claimants. Of 67,700 claimants in Newfoundland and Labrador, almost 54,000 could be classified as frequent, meaning nearly 80% of my province's EI claimants would fall into the frequent category. Nationally, the average is 32%. That's a big spread. In effect, Mr. Speaker, the changes to EI could have a disproportionately larger impact on my province than other provinces. But then that would hold true with changes to old age security and GIS, and that more Newfoundlanders and Labradorians depend on their government pensions as their main source of income. Many seasonal industries don't come with pension plans. That's a reality of life too. First the fishery, now the fishermen. In so many areas of Atlantic Canada, there is only seasonal work. It's the nature of the industry. Well, ever since the fishery was destroyed, under the Liberal and Conservative watch again. The changes to EI amount to a race to the bottom. Take, for example, a seasonal worker in Outport, Newfoundland, who finds a job that pays 70% of what they made in the fish plant. That would have to be near or at minimum wage, which a person, let alone a family, can't survive on, can't be expected to survive on top of the added expenses I mentioned earlier, daycare, fuel, that sort of thing. Let me repeat, Mr. Speaker, a race to the bottom. More people will probably draw from provincial welfare just to get by, placing a larger fiscal burden on the provinces. So let's summarize the Conservative plan for Atlantic Canada, for Outport, Newfoundland and Labrador. First, walk away from the fish and pretend like the stocks never existed. No recovery plan, no rebuilding targets. Same goes for the Conservative pretense of supporting the seal harvest. Second, abandon the fishermen. Examples of that would include the potential elimination of owner-operator fleet separation policies, which would essentially kill the traditional inshore fishery. Another example would be the steady deterioration of search and rescue, although the Conservatives are spreading a vicious rumor that the Italians are actually picking up the slack on marine medical calls. Vicious rumor. The cuts to ACOA will mean regional development boards are basically on their way out, as is any presence of the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Continuous cuts to science, continuous cuts to management. First the fish, now the fishermen. And where's the consultation, Mr. Speaker? The Conservatives have a habit of pulling legislation out of the air and ramming it down the throats of Canadians. Look at old age security and raising the age of eligibility to 67 from 65. There was no talk of that during the last federal election. That's made people scared, Mr. Speaker. It's made people scared. There was no talk of these EI changes either. In fact, there was no consultation with Canadians, period. Here's a quote from Elizabeth Beale, President of the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council. These are important policy changes, and we need a full policy discussion. Good luck with that, I say, not with this Conservative government. Beale makes another great point. What's being missed in this discussion and missed in the national dialogue is the inference that Atlantic Canadians don't want to work. You know, unemployment rates are high and therefore they all want to stay home and twiddle their fingers. The reality is completely different, Beale said. Keep in mind that the Prime Minister has said Atlantic Canada has a culture of defeat. That quote still rings in the ears of Atlantic Canadians. Culture of defeat. The changes to EI will reduce the incomes of people in rural communities who are older and unable to take jobs elsewhere. That's a fact. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. Cathy Dunderdale, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, has said there seems to be a real disconnect between what the federal government is trying to achieve and the reality of people's lives in rural parts of the country.
1 minute.
In Newfoundland and Labrador, so much of our rural areas are dependent on the fishery, what's left of it, and tourism. Both are seasonal. These changes will hurt economically sensitive areas. Let me jump ahead. First the fishery, now the fishermen. Mr. Speaker, it would seem to me that the time of this Conservative government would be better spent implementing a rebuilding plan for the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. It would seem to me, Mr. Speaker, that the time of this Conservative government would be better spent dropping plans to eliminate the owner-operator fleet separation policies. It would seem to me, Mr. Speaker, that the time of this Conservative government would be better spent giving people hope. Hope for the future. Hope for our culture and heritage. Hope, Mr. Speaker, not punishment, on top of punishment, on top of punishment. The Prime Minister said years ago that Atlantic Canada has a culture of defeat, but it is the Conservatives who are defeatist towards us. Defeatist, out of touch, and out of luck come the next election. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Medicine Hat.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was listening to my colleague, and he talked about traveling 2 hours. So I'm making an assumption that he means 1 hour to work and 1 hour back. And, Mr. Speaker, I live in a rural riding. I have people who actually drive for an hour before they can get to work, and they return for an hour to get to work. So I'm just wondering how difficult that is, because there are no subways for those transportation. There are no public transportations for those individuals to get to that work. So I'm wondering how difficult that might be, that the NDP says these people cannot go to work by traveling for an hour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for the question. It's 1 hour to get to work. It's a 1 hour to get home. Then there are added expenses on top of that. Expenses like daycare, for example, like fuel, maintenance, cars, the whole 9 yards. Then you keep this in mind. Give me a chance to speak now. Keep this in mind. That person will also be making 30% less. 30% less with extra expenses. So that's your plan for the redevelopment, for the future of rural Newfoundland and Labrador and rural Canada. Out of touch.
Before I continue with questions, I would like to remind all honourable members, and this has happened 2 or 3 times this morning, that in your questions and comments that they ought to be directed at the chair rather than at your colleagues. And as such, I just would like people to keep that in mind. It maintains a certain level of decorum in the debate. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the intervention by my colleague from St. John's South Mount Pearl. And I wanted to ask him this question. We understand that the government is heading down the road of getting rid of the owner-operator fleet separation policy that now exists, which enables small owner-operator fishermen to work in communities throughout Newfoundland and Labrador, throughout Atlantic Canada, and that they're going to get rid of that policy. Does he not see that the drive to cut EI benefits in those same communities that support seasonal fishermen is not part of the plan of this Conservative government to turn over the fishery to corporate Canada and to drive working people out of Newfoundland and Labrador and out of coastal Canada?
The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for Cole Harbour for the excellent question, and I must say he's doing an excellent job as critic for fisheries and oceans. In terms of the big picture, I think that the honourable member is dead on the money. I think that the potential elimination of owner-operator fleet separation policies will kill the traditional inshore fishery. And if you look at it from the big picture perspective, and the changes to employment insurance, which I believe will drive what Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, what rural Canadians from rural areas of Atlantic Canada we have left, will drive them out of those areas. If you look at it from the big picture perspective, I think it is a plan. And I think it's a plan by the Conservative government to do away with what's left of the traditional fisheries in Atlantic Canada. Thanks for the question.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from St. John South Mount Pearl for a very clear description of the different worlds that exist within one country. Canada is one country, and we all love it. I'm grateful that yesterday the honourable member for Calgary Centre reminded us of all that. But I'm looking at this, and I hear Conservative members of Parliament talk about how there somehow are employees not looking for work hard enough. We know they do. But I want to focus the question on the employers. In seasonal industries, the employers have benefited from EI. They need the system. It can be fixed. It can be tweaked. Things can be done. But essentially, when an employer lays off a staff at the end of a summer season, whether they're in fisheries, forestry, tourism, and sometimes in mining, they want to know that those people are willing to come back to them for the same jobs they held before they were laid off. This is an employer benefit, and I'm going to ask the honourable member if he thinks that the government has given sufficient concern to employers' dependence on this system.
The honourable member, South Mount Pearl, short answer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the good question. I've spoken with employers since these proposed changes were announced, and employers in seasonal industries, like the honourable member mentioned, like tourism, like the fishery, what they're concerned about is with these EI changes, they're going to lose skilled workers. Yes, they're seasonal workers. They don't work 52 weeks of the year. But if you work in the fish plant, if you work in the tourism industry, if you work in the crafts industry, the list goes on and on. You're talking about a skill set that could potentially be lost because the workers have to move because the changes in the EI regulations. So very good question. Employers are very concerned. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise de débat, l'honorable député.